Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, and that concludes general questions. We turn now to First Minister's questions, and we start with question number 1 from Jackson Carlow.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've learnt over the last 2 years that the First Minister has become a great fan of unions. So, can the First Minister explain why would it be in Scotland's interest to fracture the one union that matters most to us, our own, with the rest of the United Kingdom?
First Minister.
Well, of course, the European Union is a union of independent countries, and look how it has stood by and stood up for Ireland over these last 2 years. By contrast, as I said to the Prime Minister on the telephone just last night, the United Kingdom government has ignored Scotland, sidelined Scotland, cast aside Scotland's interests, now stands on the brink not just of taking us out of the European Union against our will, or taking us out of the single market against our interests. They now stand on the brink of placing Scotland at a real competitive disadvantage with Northern Ireland. That's not an academic or an abstract argument. That will have real implications for jobs and living standards and investment in Scotland. So I don't think the Tories care a jot about that. Of course, it's not so long ago that the Secretary of State for Scotland, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, were saying that if there was a separate relationship with the UK for Northern Ireland, they would resign. Where is David Mundell today?
Jackson Carlow. Order, please. Jackson Carlow.
Let me be absolutely crystal clear. Others may be abandoning their post, but none of us on these benches are going anywhere. We'll be staying here. We'll be staying right here every day, every week, holding this First Minister and this Scottish Government to account. And let me be also clear. Ruth Davidson and David Mundell have spent the last year fighting for the United Kingdom. They're not going to take any lessons from anyone else. Not any carpetbagger who's come late to the defence of the United Kingdom, and certainly not from this First Minister.
First Minister.
Well, can I just try to strike one note of consensus here? I agree with Jackson Carlow when he says that the Tories are staying exactly where they are. It's called opposition, and they don't deserve to be anywhere else. Now, you know, I always thought it was a really odd position for Ruth Davidson and David Mundell to argue against Northern Ireland getting a deal that protects their vital interests. Instead of arguing for Scotland to get a similar deal, it was standing up for the DUP rather than standing up for Scotland. But, you know, having chosen that red line, and they chose it, then it is really, really hard to see how they stay in office after today with a shred of credibility. Let me quote the letter from David Mundell and Ruth Davidson just a few weeks ago. Any deal that undermines the integrity of the UK internal market or of the United Kingdom, that was a red line. They were briefing, that was a resignation issue. And then you've got Dominic Raab today, the Brexit Secretary, who's been involved in these negotiations, being very clear. This deal presents a very real threat to the integrity of the United Kingdom. Esther McVey saying exactly the same. Now, if I was as cynical and as completely self-serving as the Tories, that actually might tempt me to vote for this deal, but I am not. But what is absolutely unclear to me is how David Mundell or Ruth Davidson can have any other option but to follow through on the principled commitment that they made. So let's see, over the course of today, do they have any principle? Do they have a backbone between them? I suspect that answer is going to be a resounding no.
Jackson Carlow.
First Minister, let's be candid with the Chamber. You and I have one very particular thing in common. Neither of us is going to be First Minister after the next Scottish election. But I know a woman who will be, and I'm just keeping her seat warm. Fracturing the UK internal market is exactly what the First Minister continually proposes. How if Scotland were to have a different trading arrangement from England, then as night follows day, we would create a problem where none currently exists, a border at Berwick. Scotland facing restrictions on a trading market 4 times as important to us as the EU. How is that standing up for Scotland? How can this possibly help our country prosper?
First Minister.
Jackson Carlaw used to have a reputation for half-decent jokes. I think that reputation has been completely shattered over the course of this session. But Jackson Carlaw has just stood here and uttered the phrase, "No problem currently exists." Is he watching what is happening in the House of Commons right now? The Tory government is imploding as we speak. People the length and breadth of the UK are seriously worried about their jobs, about their living standards, all of which are on the line because of the ideology of this Tory government and the complete shambles that they have made of the negotiation. How dare Jackson Carlaw stand in this chamber and say there is no problem? There is a big problem for Scotland, and let me spell it out to Jackson Carlaw. Scotland faces being taken out of the European Union against our democratic wishes. Scotland faces being taken out of the single market against our economic interests. And now we face being put at a competitive disadvantage to Northern Ireland. That's what the Tories are presiding over. And Jackson Carlaw and every single member of the Tory benches should be completely and utterly ashamed of themselves.
Jackson Carlaw.
It's the same tired old lines from the same tired old First Minister. You know, this First Minister made her priorities clear the morning after the 2016 referendum result. Before even the votes had been counted, her first actions were to get on to her civil servants, demanding they start drafting a bill for an independence referendum. It's been that grudge and grievance agenda that has seen her act in a way which is nothing other than destructive to the negotiations that have been taking place over the last 2 years. And everything she has said and done since has been pursued relentlessly with that goal in mind, even now using the history of Northern Ireland with all the desperate turmoil that is involved for her singular political advantage. That's the disgrace today. So turn the First Minister's cliché in its own head, she should be thoroughly ashamed of herself. The First Minister exploiting the coming days to pursue her own goals as she has done over recent months, over and over again, is fundamentally against the country's interests. We need a First Minister acting for all of Scotland. Is it at times she acted in the national interest, not the nationalist interest? With everything that's going on, and acknowledging that, will she now take her threat of a second independence referendum and all the additional disruption that would cause off the table? Will she, yes or no?
First Minister.
Talk about tired old rhetoric. There's only one person in this chamber indulging in that today. And what a nerve! What a nerve for Jackson Carlaw to come to this chamber and talk about the importance of finding solutions for Northern Ireland. It was David Mundell and Ruth Davidson who wrote to the Prime Minister opposing a separate deal for Northern Ireland. All I'm asking for is if Northern Ireland is to get a separate deal for very good reasons, I support that, then Scotland should not be placed at a disadvantage as a result of that. And as for Jackson Carlaw's statement that the Scottish Government has been, destructive to the negotiations. Scotland hasn't been allowed into these negotiations. We haven't had the opportunity to be destructive to the negotiations. Now, I do support remaining in the European Union. I've been consistent about that. But from day one, I have put forward compromises. I have put forward the compromise of the UK staying in the single market and the customs union. I've lost count of the number of times I have asked the Prime Minister to consider that sensible option. But she's been too busy pandering to the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg. Well, I think the chickens are going to come home to roost on that today, as Jacob Rees-Mogg and his colleagues probably bring her down. I'm pretty confident, because I'll put my case to the Scottish people, that I'll be First Minister after the next Scottish election. I'm not confident the Prime Minister will be in office by the end of today, such as the shambles she has created of these negotiations. And as I said earlier on, she should be ashamed of that, Jackson Carlaw should be ashamed of that, and every single Tory in the country should be ashamed of the mess they're creating for people the length and breadth of the UK.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, Theresa May's government is falling apart before our very eyes. The Northern Ireland Minister, gone. The Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, gone. Even the Secretary of State for Brexit, gone. So can I ask the First Minister, does she agree with me that it is time for the wretched Tory government to go as well?
First Minister.
Yes.
Richard Leonard.